Greetings, everyone, and thank you, and welcome to the third day of the Milken Institute Global Conference, fourth if you happen to have managed to wander into the Sunday reception. We are here today to actually discuss something that I consider to be a very important issue, and actually it's an issue that really reflects broader attitudes and issues in our society. It's issues of what our chairman would call a human capital. It's issues of social capital. It is issues, in particular, the idea that we, for those of us who are in my generation, shall we say, since I'm a Gen Xer, and I'm willing to admit that, is not as cool as a baby, not as overwhelming as a baby boomer, or as cool as a millennial, shall we say? But it's an issue that's profoundly is that growing up when I did in the immediate post-Vietnam era, that it's in coming out of what had been up to the 1960s was this fundamental issue of the promise of national military service. That if you go back and you look at World War II and you look at the generations afterwards and you look at the sense that existed throughout this country of the idea that national service was not only an honored calling, but with actions such as the GI Bill and various efforts that were made, fundamentally affected the character of our country, and in many ways brought people together. Not only did World War II do so, but the country was together through Korea. The country was together initially in Vietnam, even if it fractured later. And that issue of serving the country and the idea of why you do it in that and not just in the military, but fundamentally in ways, various other ways. During the Depression, there were numerous efforts that were done, ranging things like the Civil Conservation Corps and the WPA, that not only might give people jobs, but actually worked for the betterment of the community and society. And in the military, service was considered to be a key pathway, not only for serving the country, but fundamentally that what would happen afterwards, and the promise and the honor of service. But we are right now in a society where less than 1% percentage-wise of the population is in the military. Maybe if you include all the veterans, including World War II veterans, maybe 7% of the society is veterans. And that is a profound shift from a time period where in World War II, it felt like everybody knew somebody who served, even if they didn't. Everybody had a family member or a relative. So now, I will admit, given the audience, and that this is a slightly disproportionate question to ask, but the first thing we just want to ask everyone is, how many of you here are either current or former members of the U.S. military? And we can raise your hand. Okay, so we got a good number. And it said, how many of you are related to somebody who actually served in the military, as well as those people who have served? So we've got a much bigger number, but which I'm very glad to see, because it says that we've got the right audience and people are interested. But if you think about it, that's also not a number that particularly aligns very well with the general populace. And one of the things that we're going to talk about on this session is the fact that there is an increasing disconnect. There's a disconnect in some ways that's been building for a long time, both in terms of society's connection to those who are in uniform, the ability for people to transition from in uniform into the civilian populace. One of the things, if you notice that the men and women in uniform who are here in this room largely are members of what we call our military leadership circle, and it's something that we're very thrilled at the Institute to be involved with. But part of the reason for that is fundamentally this issue of service and transition, and it's and to forge those connections. The four members we have on our panel are four individuals who can draw on their extensive not only public service, but also a lot of their experiences, not only with themselves, but people they know, people who have gone through significant transitions and have a lot of experience to offer. So now I'm going to go from all the way over on my right. On my right is Cutler Dawson, who's President and CEO of the Navy Federal Credit Union, which, yes, in fact, he is a Naval Academy graduate and admiral who served for over 35 years in the military, but he actually now runs America's, actually it's the world's largest credit union, isn't it? Yep. So So when he's making jokes like he did earlier about repossessing your car, he's not kidding.
I know how to do it. I know how to do it.
Yeah, to my immediate right is Susan Eisenhower, who is the CEO and chairman of the Eisenhower Group. She is somebody who is very much has been engaged in national service, although she, in her career, she has done a number of different things, and I won't even list all of them, but in particular, she has been a key person on nuclear issues, nuclear non-proliferation and agreement issues. She is one of the country's most profound and premier experts on Russia-U.S. relations. She has, in fact, even on everything else, even served on the National Advisory Council involving the International Space Station management. So, and I could actually go on for a whole long list. And yeah, somewhere in her family, she's got a number of different members who've served, including, you know, that sort of renegade brother who went in the Navy. Otherwise,
I know.
yeah. Otherwise, she is definitely she lives and breathes Army. So. Immediately to my left, to your right, is Major General Mark Graham, who is currently, among many things, is director of the Vets for Warriors program and the senior director of Rutgers UBHC's National Call Center, where he, among other things, is still serving in a key position of advising veterans on numerous different issues in their lives. He is also a very long-time veteran, having served almost 35 years in numerous different locations around the world. And he'll admit that he differs a little bit in that somewhere in there, in the midst of all his military service, he actually got an MBA from Oklahoma City University. To my far left, your right, is Brigadier General Blaine Holt, who is here to provide a little variation in that he actually was in the Air Force. And he is not only has a very long distinguished career in the military, but also has distinguished himself in two leading positions in the private sector. First as president of Millionaire, which was the world's #1 private aviation service provider, and then now where he's at Braidy Industries, where he was a founding leader and is involved in innovation in multi-materials and lots of different materials, technologies, and sciences. And so, again, very glad to have you as well. So, what I would like to do is jump right in, and first thing I'm going to reverse things back, Blaine, I'm going to ask you first, is that what have you found to be the major misunderstandings and gaps in information for veterans who are trying to integrate into civil society?
Well, thanks for that, and it's an honor to be here with you all today and sitting up here with this panel. Quite an honor. The question is very important, and it hits me personally in my own transition. The military tries very hard, with the massive size of its bureaucracy, to have transition assistance programs, to give you a foot on the way out the door, to help you bridge. And unfortunately, I'm going to be very critical of all those programs. They are in massive need of overhaul and update. And I think in the military, we do a poor job of articulating what it is we've done on active duty and how that can help employers in the private sector. And then on the other side of that, because it works both ways, there are civilian companies who look right past amazing talent because they don't know what they're looking at. And they can't read into the military performance reports. You know, they're all seemingly inflated, but they're written in code. And so I can pick up a sailor, a Marine, an airman's fit rep, and look at it, and I can tell you within 5 seconds whether this person's really on track and on fire and doing well or not. But what you'll see is awesome, best ever, save the day, but it's the words that count. And so I would encourage civilian companies to have someone on their HR staff, if not the HR director themselves, as with our company, that is a vet, that has that background, that can turn that flashlight on for you and find amazing talent to go into these companies. And so there's an information gap on both sides. The other thing is, we're not getting our vets to get interested in what their lives outside of the military are going to look like early enough. And so a lot of our active duty with us during our conversations in these last 3 days, my advice has been, you know, start early, start 3-4 years out, try on a bunch of different sets of clothes. Are you going to be like me and you want to sweat payroll and build a company and throw some shovels in the ground, or you know, are you going to get into medical law? What is it going to be? And then try that on. And I think the Milken conference does a lot of that for these folks here in the room, but we've got a few extra in the military besides these folks here. And so I would encourage all of us to take a role in working those information seams to open up the portal of a ton of great talent that can actually take your company to or your enterprise to a much better place.
Well, thank you. And Mark, just sort of following up on that, is that what are the most common concerns that veterans direct to you and your team about adjusting to civilian life?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And again, I'm also honored to be here and for the Milken Institute, and thank you for this. You know, at Vets for Warriors, we're a national program that answers the phone within 30 seconds, 24 hours a day. It's a peer support program, so that anyone's ever worn the nation's uniform or their family can call. And they call for a variety of reasons. Some are struggling, some are not. Some we're doing okay, but they've hit a bump in the road and they're having some challenges, so they call to talk to us, and we follow up and call them back. And what we find is many of our callers are calling in as they're transitioning. They're terrified financially, terrified, and they don't know, they're worried, where's the next paycheck coming from? So oftentimes, I think that drives people to the wrong, not necessarily the wrong place, but the first opportunity that pops up. I had a boss tell me when I was retiring, he goes, Mark, do not rush to unhappiness, which I thought was a great advice. And so the number one thing, Kevin, I think that they call for is they're worried about where's that next paycheck coming from. And they sadly don't worry about it until about 2 to 3 months before they leave. They don't do it sooner. And you know, I wish I could sit up here and tell you I did, but I got to tell you, I think from young enlisted soldier to the senior military leaders on the officer side, we tend to wait too long. And so I agree that we've got to do that earlier on. And I think the other thing that is housing. People say, well, you know, where are you going to go? They're looking for somewhere to work, and they're looking for a place to live. And if they don't find a place to live and somewhere to work, where are they going to go? They're going to go back to wherever it was they came from. And that very well could be some of the reasons they came into the military, is they wanted to get out of the environment they were in, or they wanted to try something different, and they might not necessarily want to go back there, but they don't give an option. So we really need to help them develop options before they leave. And when they call Vets for Warriors, what we do is we help connect them to other organizations and resources that do great work, to organizations that help find employment. They can help them figure out, how do you translate that language? And also we look at employers and help employers to know, it's not charity hiring a veteran, it's an investment in your organization to hire a veteran, because they're amazing young people and they can do great things for your company, and they can really open the aperture. But we've got to help the young military members as they're transitioning. We ask them, if you were a civilian and you looked at your resume, would you understand what you did in the military? And I got to tell you, by far the answer is, yeah, good point, not really, because we just write them the wrong way.
Well, in following up on that specifically, is that Cutler, is it one of the things is we talked about how the military makes up a very small percentage of the population, 1%, and veterans are at most 7%. So how do you create understanding and relatable experiences for society as a whole, especially employers, for people coming out of service?
I think 3 things come to mind to me. One, we continue to have discussions like we're having this week here at the conference. The more discussions we can have about it, the better off everyone's going to be. 2, I'm a big believer in the military, what I'll call the Embark program. That's what we call it in the Navy, where we'll bring influencers, educators, other folks out to an aircraft carrier to spend 2 days. They'll fly out, they'll make an arrested landing, they'll observe the flight operations, and then they'll spend the night and catapult off the next day. When they do that, I'd like to say that we make a fan for life. You can't help to see those men and women that are working on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier and come away with an admiration for their dedication, but also their training and their discipline. I think that's something that all the services do, and the more some of you on active duty can encourage that, that would be terrific too. Thirdly, I think we need to continue the efforts of employers bringing aboard veterans, but employers will be the best advocates after they've done that. So how do we get their voice heard to tell people about what they have brought aboard, what it's done for their organization, and the goodness that it's brought to them?
Thank you. And I can absolutely testify to the fact that watching the crew on an aircraft carrier go about their duties and seeing not just the pilots but everyone is amazing and really does testify to their dedication. So, but I also aware of the fact there's a limit to how many people you can get to put in that situation.
Well, if they like you, you have a round trip. If they don't like you, you stay on board.
Actually, if they, actually, even if they don't like you, you can wind up being nauseous for 24 hours. But that's it. But now I would like to pull back a little bit for Susan, just to give us a bit more broad perspective. Is that one of the things we talked about early on is that the people growing up up through Vietnam with the draft, and following Vietnam, you see a significant cultural divide has grown between the military and civilian worlds. And how has that happened? And how much of it was the abolition of the draft? How much of it was other changes?
Well, maybe a segue between the earlier questions and this particular one relates to the fact that we really don't have that many veterans in Congress anymore. And that gets at the heart of our capacity to reform some of these programs you're talking about, and also for members of Congress to serve as a symbol of the transferable skills that are possible when you are in the military and then you transition into a completely different culture in the civilian world. So I think that some of these veterans are coming along. Some of them are running for Congress now, and this is nothing but a good thing, I think, for civil-military relations. I guess just on the point of this great divide, we can all see the difference between our societies before and after the Vietnam period. I'm thinking about the Vietnam period. Actually, I should go even farther back. During World War II, we had 16 million people in this country supporting the war effort. I mean, I'm talking about as a job, as opposed to buying war bonds and all of the other things that were inherent in supporting the war effort. And so it's not surprising today with the volunteer military that there are a few connection points. And the other thing I will mention, because yes, okay, all Army all the time. We're glad to see they're winning some football games here again. Right, but I was one of those bridge kids. I was an Army brat. My grandfather Dwight was the class of 1915 at West Point. My father was the class of 1944 at West Point. And on my mother's side, her father fought in the First World War, the Second World War, and the Korean War. And his sons both went to West Point. Then this brother of mine who went into the Navy. That's another comment. But once I became a part of the civilian world, I was absolutely astonished at how little these two communities know about each other. And the other thing that's very noteworthy, and I've had several people say, "Why didn't you go to West Point?" Well, it wasn't possible. I mean, I show my age here, but it wasn't possible at the time I was coming along. But it's amazing how many military leaders have kids who go into the military. And so this becomes almost like a caste-like situation where the military is made up of military brats who are now in the military. And this creates a lack of understanding that the public has very little exposure to that world. And I think this is the reason West Point and I'm sure the Naval Academy does the same thing, to really aggressively address civil-military relations, which is a good thing.
Yep. And it's actually a very good thing. And but yes, is that one of the things I think that's important just in relation to that is that when people are in the military, there is at least sometimes it's transitory because people, because you get moved quite often, but there's at least a support structure on the bases. That generally there's, education. There's education. If it's not there, it's nearby. There's housing. There's the family support and social support structure. And when not only the member of the military transitions out, but any members of the family transition out, that culture and that support structure goes away. And so, one of the things, just in relation to it, is that how much of an impact does that have, just leaving that support structure? And is there any of the branches of the military that actually handle it, not to even just tout your own background, but any branch of the military that does a better job of it, that actually seems to prepare people a bit better for transitioning into civilian life?
Is that to me?
Well, it's all of you. So,
Well,
Mark, you want to go ahead, since you're. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure exactly the other services and how they do. I know a little bit. I don't think we do a great job of that, and I think it's kind of thank you for your service, and they give you a little, but then you're on your own. I mean, it's kind of next in the door, and you're out the door, and that's not to be pejorative. I mean, it's just true. I mean, you serve, you did well, thank you very much, and now you're next. And there's not a place, like I said, young folks that call our line. They're concerned about finances and housing because they're concerned about their family members. Family members can call the line too. We have family members that call, and they're concerned about when their spouse is getting ready to retire. What about them and the children? What do they do? So they're concerned too. So I don't think we do a great job of that. I think the key though is employment. If they know they've got employment, that solves so many other challenges that they're going to face, because if they've got employment, they'll be able to find housing. They'll be able to embed into community. And we really try to connect those that contact us into community-based organizations so that they become a part of the community. And we talk to them, encourage them that early on. Become involved in the community, a part of the community. Because we said, when the community realizes you're a veteran, they'll realize and embrace you and help you. So one is I don't think we do a great job of that. But two, I'm not sure that if we can't figure out the employment thing, it doesn't, frankly, solve a lot of its own self.
I think, and building on what Susan was saying about the insularity of military culture, one of the very promising ideas that has been talked about in recent years, but I'd love to see action taken, would be opening up new pipelines into the active duty forces. And what I mean by that is, suppose you have a mid-career programmer over at Facebook who knows a whole lot about cybersecurity. The ability for them to jump into a military role for 2 to 3 years and then jump back out of that role would cross-pollinate that culture. Mm-hmm. In the military setting, we need that very badly because we're now out of incremental times and into exponential times. And our technologies are moving along at a very, very fast clip. And so a lot of the types of things that we need to have our forces on active duty exposed to, the technologies, they seem to be on the outside moving at a much faster pace. And so if you created this cross-pollination track, now you've busted through some of these insularities, the concept of the PX, the base exchange, this is where we move, we're on post. They go back into society with a deeper appreciation for what it means to be in the military. And our folks get a window into what that looks like on the outside and can better prepare.
I'd like to just add something here which doesn't get discussed too much. We often talk about very important issues like employment and housing and things that have to do with simply surviving. But what I think we don't do a very good job of is preparing the military to enter what is really a very lonely world, relatively speaking. Mm-hmm. I mean, the military is a deeply supportive ecosystem. And since there have been so many deployments overseas, wives have become tremendously connected to each other. And the minute you enter the civilian community, I'm telling you, it is a completely different story. It is a lonely place outside of the military ecosystem. And I don't know if we do enough preparation in that area, helping people stay in touch with their old colleagues. And then, of course, the final point I'd make on this is that you can never replace the bonding that occurs among the military community, both because of these deployments and because of the support that's given on Army posts and elsewhere to spouses who are left behind. And so directing people into jobs that might be in comparably supportive environments might be a good transition into the bigger, even lonelier world beyond that.
I'd like to add that one of the things we can't forget is the spouses.
Yeah.
That it's a team. It's a military team that includes the spouses. And how do we promote them? How do we get them their own careers as we have more and more families that have two people that are both working? I can tell you where I am at Navy Federal, we have 17,000 employees. 68% of them are women. Many of them are spouses of military personnel. And think about it, when the spouse moves, their career moves with it. But that not all those opportunities exist for other spouses. So, but it's not all negative either, though. I will tell you, with my family and my children, in my 14 deployments in my time in the Navy, I was gone a lot. They all did well. They moved from school to school, but I think it made them stronger in a lot of ways. But Susan, to your point, 2 out of 3 join the service, and it spirals together. So.
Now, you mentioned the sheer number of overseas deployments you had. Is that how does it affect both you and your family? How does it affect members of the service, especially if they're separated from their families on a recurring basis?
Well, the biggest challenge was for my wife, who, when I came back from deployment, had let me think I was in charge again. I wasn't. Yeah, I think many of us could relate to that here. But the biggest challenge is getting back into the routine of your family, the routine of your community. But it's not an overwhelming challenge.
Susan, you had a father who was deployed he was gone for at least a year at one point, wasn't he, on deployment? And,
in Korea.
In Korea,
Mm-hmm.
and so he certainly was sent around quite a bit, and then once he retired, went out and became an ambassador. So he clearly liked being deployed.
Actually, I'm very proud of the fact that yes, he became an ambassador. But if you were to put anything on his gravestone, but it was too small to put. The one big thing, writer is what he would have wanted to have. He had a very distinguished career as a military historian.
Yeah.
But you know, he also taught English at West Point at some point in his career. So this was the card he had up his sleeve, is that when he finally got out of the military, he wanted to write books. But if it, you know, at the risk of making this all sound way too personal on my side, I'd just like to tell you about my other grandfather very quickly, not the Eisenhower grandfather, but the Thompson grandfather, who fought in those 3 wars in combat, got a Silver Star in Italy, and was on the G2 team during Korea and had the great joy of letting General MacArthur know that the Chinese were coming. In any case, when he retired, he did something completely different. So I'd like to challenge you to think about, don't underestimate doing something utterly different. You know what he did? He read for the bar, and he became an attorney in Gainesville, Florida, and I'm very proud of this fact because he got his retirement pay. He only represented indigent people in Florida who couldn't afford lawyers. And I'd say that's a life well lived. But who would have thunk that he would go from, you know, these combat positions, he retired as a colonel, into the law. So sometimes we get a little bit too focused on simply extending what you already know about the military. What he had was a big heart, and he deployed his big heart into a completely different area.
I'd like to follow on that. I like to say that folks that are in the military have an accelerated life, an accelerated experience, and they can, to Susan's point, they can do anything that they set out to do. They've had training, they've been exposed to discipline, they've had experiences that most people don't get to have in this accelerated life. They can problem solve. Aviators are the best in the world at risk management. They do it every day they go flying. You can apply that to business. You can apply that to many other things, and just like your grandfather did.
Well, I just think that we need to be encouraging people to think outside of the box, because all of those traits you're saying are in actually surprisingly short supply in the civilian world.
That's actually something that's a comment that I've heard repeatedly is that, trying to push innovative thinking on people who are already in the military, but if you look about just how risk averse a lot of times people in the civilian world are and not able to adapt, that coming in with a different perspective can be a big deal. I mean, Blaine, that's clearly something that you're spending time on, so can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So there is a culture in all services of what I would call the rabble-rouser class. And these are folks with a warrior mindset, and they have the same traits as you would identify with anybody on the civilian side in terms of your innovators and your mavericks who want to challenge convention. And we talked about this a little bit in the military breakfast a couple of days ago, but there was flag officers warning our young folks here saying, well, be careful when you do that because you could get in a lot of trouble. But a lot of them are up for that kind of trouble because in our culture, we develop a passion for the mission. And it's all core to your oath. And if your oath is to defend and support the Constitution of the United States, well, then that leaves open a lot of possibilities as to how that gets defined below. And so if you have a great commander who fosters a very professional but a welcoming environment to new ideas, where the watch phrase is, you know what we could do, ... And then you get the ones who are like, does he or she mean it? Can I come out of the shadows? Can I introduce my new program? And if you start to foster that, it can build on itself. I was General Petraeus' commander in Kyrgyzstan, and I arrived to an eviction notice from a corrupt regime, and before you know it, we got to stay, and 9 months later we had what I knew would happen, which was a bloody coup. And General Petraeus was that type of commander. He told me, he said, Blaine, this is at the beginning of my wonderful year there, and I absolutely adored it as a turning point year for me. I spoke Kyrgyz, I went native, I built yurts. But he said, Blaine, every decision, military decision made in Kyrgyzstan is your decision. If you make the wrong decisions, I'll fire you. Now, what could be a better environment for a leader to lead in, to have that kind of leash? And so I'm on TV with their Oprah Winfrey equivalent doing a live broadcast in my dress blues from Bishkek to Moscow, speaking Kyrgyz and answering questions in Russian. And next day, my other boss, General Hostage, our air boss, we called that a hostage situation when he would come.
Shocking.
But he came and said, Blaine, what's going on? I said, well, I just did the craziest thing I've ever done in my life. And he said, well, most of my wing commanders, if I ask them that, I don't care, but suddenly I'm very interested. What would that be like for you? And I told him about the TV program, and he said, you didn't want to ask me about that before we got going on something like that? And I said, oh, you'd never have let me do that. And he said, well, how did it go? And I said, well, it went awesome. We're getting rave reviews from everybody. The only people who are upset are the Russians. He said, oh, well, this is great. Now, at Braidy Industries, that's the corporate culture that I'm building right now. And it's under construction. I've got scaffolding up, and I've got paint out and spackle, and we're building this culture of, you know what we could do. And it's going to drive our competition bananas. And we will do that with a third vet labor, a third the folks right there in Appalachia who desperately need that region turned around. And we'll do that with a third, which I would call donations from my competitors, involuntary donations. But that's how you embrace innovation, and they all have it.
Great.
That's great.
You know, one thing I think it's important for employers to know is be careful when you hire veterans to hire them at entry level only. That tends to happen a lot. Well, you don't really know the industry, so I'm going to bring you at the low level. That frustrates them because oftentimes they know they can do more right away. They might not know your industry, but they know a lot. They know teamwork, they're smart, they study, they love training, they understand what training is. So if you help steer them in the right direction, they'll study, they'll work hard, they'll learn fast. And be careful not to hem them in. Because I think oftentimes, I think the nation's doing a better job of employing veterans. I think the key now is how you keep those veterans employed in the same organization so you your investment's worth it because you bring them in. But you got to give them a little latitude. In the military, we always say left and right limits. Give them a little more latitude to think out of the box a little bit, to be innovative, because they'll think of issues and challenges and opportunities for your companies from a different perspective than a lot of your other employees. So I think it's important as we bring in veterans to one is don't just bring them in entry level. Look at their skill set and then maybe bring them in a little higher level. One is I think you'll retain more of them, and I think you'll find that they'll do great work for your organization because they'll be very loyal to what you do. The other thing I'd like to jump back in is something we mentioned about the communities. Not that many people live on a military installation. I commanded in Fort Carson, Colorado, right. And there was 500,000 people outside the gate. So a lot of people, most of the families, 70% lived on off post in the communities. So I think one of the things we need to do is how do we figure out in the nation so that others in a country, because if you live around a military town, everyone loves the military, they know it. But there's a lot of patriotic Americans around America who don't live near a military installation. So how do we get that connection working, I think is really key for us.
One of the things that came up actually a while ago when I was at some of the research work we did is that we wound up looking at sources of potential talent for different industries in area. And I did work in Florida, and Florida was actually touted the fact that at the time Jacksonville was one of the main exit points from the military. That it was, and that Jacksonville considered it to be a real positive. But one of the questions was they knew that they had a lot of military who left, that they felt supported in Jacksonville, that it was a good environment, but economically they were having trouble placing the soldiers into good economic positions. And not only Jacksonville, you also had the area up in the Panhandle, the Florida Panhandle, because of Eglin Air Force Base and the number of people who were leaving there. In California, there is no question that having the Navy base in San Diego has had a very profound impact on it in terms of, and there are a number of industries that have grown up and existed in San Diego that fundamentally rely on former military members coming out with skills, electronic skills, technical skills, and so on, and they've been able to figure that out, and sometimes communities do that. The one contrast I have is Long Beach, which when I was growing up was very much of a Navy town in California. And I mean, and you could tell is that Long Beach, a lot of the state's most prominent Republican politicians came from Long Beach. It was very much of the, the shipyards are here. I knew people who were stationed there. And then, base realignment happened, it all went away, right. And that disconnect absolutely happened. And there is, you talk to anybody except for some retirees, there's nobody who really knows that connection. So building that connection, that relationship, not only in terms of socially, but economically is a big deal. So and I think that's, one of the other things you do that, just to transition on that, is that we've talked a little bit about some of the downsides of the programs within the military that aren't working very well in transitions. What are the programs that exist outside the military that do a good job? What are they? Are there anything that we can look at and say this is a best example? And let's be honest, not even just in the U.S. If you know of any somewhere else that's outside the U.S. that do a good job of transitioning soldiers into civilian life.
I'm going to look at Blaine and let him answer that question, because I don't have an answer to it.
So benchmark companies that are much larger that are very notable, I would take you to, well, first off, we're going to be a superstar at it. I can tell you that.
Well, that's
our
great.
HR director is an Army Special Forces colonel retired, and and I'll say this lovingly, my Navy pork chop is running our war room. Now pork chop is a logistician, and he was my deputy in theater logistics, and so we will excel at this. But I would point out that Goldman Sachs has an outstanding program, and they bring in approximately 50 to 60 a year. And I have had the opportunity to sit down with some Navy SEAL friends of mine, some Army friends of mine, who have gone down that pipe, and the training that they've got, and converting their attention to detail, their laser focus, and changing those learning curves that they have into financial learning curves. Even if they don't come from financial backgrounds. I don't have an MBA, I don't have a business school pedigree. Goldman's doing a fine job of doing that level of integration. Another one that I'll give kudos to, and I'll say it about their hiring program, maybe not other things, is Amazon. Amazon is doing a marvelous job, and they are scarfing up mid to senior level officers as fast as they can get their hands on them. And they're really doing a good job getting that culture into what it is they're doing. But what I'll end with is a sad note. I will caution every hiring authority and CEO about your retained searches and your headhunters. If you don't specifically put in the charter that you might be looking for a vet, if you don't specifically look at them in the eye and say, it's okay to bring me a vet, many of them are going to see looking at a veteran and looking into those skills to do a match as too risky to put in front of you because it may not work out. And those, a lot of headhunters want to do just a direct skill match. If it's not in the charter, they disqualify the candidate, you don't even get the screen. And I can tell you, in my own experience of interviewing, it's very frustrating to say, no, I'm just exactly what you're looking for. Can you just give me my day in court and get me that interview? There's a lot of folks and a lot of talent that's going by the wayside because of a very risk-averse HR hiring profession. And it's not their fault. It's the way that the system works. So I would say jump over that, put it in the charter, and be open to them going off and finding some of that talent.
Blaine, what's been your experience about the E4s and E5s that are getting out after 4 years, 6 years? Because there are a lot of them.
Right.
And,
that's where the rubber meets the road. So the E4s and the E5s, in my view, are the most important ranks in the United States military, period, end of story. Many of them will exit without degrees, probably going to be a 50-50 proposition there. Some will exit like one of my loadmasters, who was a three-striper, went into law school immediately following, got his bachelor's degree at 35,000 feet, flying into Afghanistan and Iraq, goes to UConn, graduates top 3% of his class, and has devoted his law practice to defending vets who have no defense in a situation where they can't afford an attorney. If you can get your hands on able-bodied E4s and E5s, you will be in very good shape. Their learning curves are amazing. And if you can just do what I said at the outset, and you can get into what their fitness reports look like and start to shed what looks like fluff from the, oh my gosh, this is a real performer. But right now, this body of people is ill-served mostly with their transition programs. And they lack the ability to articulate, hey, I'm here, hire me. And so right now, it's art, not science with that demographic. And it's Rolodexing and networking. And honestly, our third of vets, I will be filling the roles with those folks. And at Braidy, our starting salary is going to be $65,000 plus bonus.
Blaine, could I ask you a question? I mean, I think you pointed out something that it has been very surprising for me, that the headhunters, well, of course, there are a lot of not just headhunters are risk averse these days,
Sure.
but is any effort being done actually to try and educate headhunters? I know that there's some effort underway to educate heads of corporations and the rest of it, but I mean, maybe there's a way to make an advocate out of, one of the big headhunting firms.
One of the things we're doing at Vets for Warriors is we've had one webinar, we're going to have another one, and the second webinar is going to be for HR professionals.
Oh, great.
To talk to HR professionals about this. I think one of the things is you talk about E3s, E4s, E5s as they transition out. To me, it's on the military leaders. I mean, military leaders, no matter what rank you are, you need to ask the young service member the question, what are you going to do when you leave?
That's right.
Yeah.
What are your plans? What are you thinking about doing? And get them, because a lot of times they're working hard and they're not thinking about that. So if we just ask the question, don't leave it to the transition program to help them figure that out. But if they see their leaders involved and engaged and say, so what are you going to do when you leave the military?
Yeah, I'm going to interject for one moment just because I'm aware of the fact that some people actually will be watching this online. I know the room knows what an E4 and E5 is, but if you want to just mention, just for the sake of anybody who doesn't, which equivalent enlisted ranks those are.
Yeah, so when you come in the Army, you're at an E1, which is enlisted for the first grade, and then you go up E2, E3, E4. It's just a progression system, and it's a little different in each of the services. The Navy ranks are certainly different than the Army and the Marine Corps, and the Air Force is a little different. So it's enlisted grades, E1 through E9. Mm-hmm. So E3 and E4, you're mid-grade, you're younger, mid-grade, becoming a non-commissioned officer.
Right. So you've taken an enlistment, you've got some training, and you're in for 4 to 6 years based on what that training is. And that's what the equivalent is. And so in the Air Force, we would say, oh, well, it's a three-striper and they're about ready to get out. But I think, and I want to capitalize on what you said, leaders absolutely have to lead, And you absolutely have to look them in the eye and say, what is that plan going to be? And please don't tell me you're leaving here empty-handed. You've got your GI Bill in your back pocket. You've got resources. We can get you there. But I would go around my squadron and make a handshake deal with everybody. When are we going to talk about your degree? Or I do it in front of their mothers. I do it at the enlisted awards events and just sit there and say, so when are we getting that degree? And one time they didn't go enlist for the class I wanted them to, so I picked up my phone and I started dialing their mom's number. And he goes, you can't do that, that's against the rules. And I said, I certainly can. Go get a JAG. And he goes, okay, I'll take the class. But you got to be hands-on.
The reason, by the way, I digressed into that is because one of the points that actually brings up for me is that there is a translation issue. We've been talking about educating HR directors, but there's a real issue in terms of educating, especially enlisted, but even officers, about how do you translate the skills that are very clearly defined, very clear positions in the military that quite honestly have very clear civilian equivalents in terms of certain kinds of programming skills, mechanical skills, command skills, administrative skills, bookkeeping skills, that have certain specific terminology in the military that don't translate well on paper unless somebody advises them. How do we do that?
Well, some of it's simple, but not so simple. For those of us that were on active duty and are on active duty, they know what I mean when I say E4, E5, who have fulfilled a contract. They have done everything, or E5, E6, everything that they've been asked to do, and therefore if they go to work somewhere else, they're going to be committed. It's a very, it's the first question I ask anyone when I see them that's, well, how long were you in the service? And if they say 4 years, check. I know they have served honorably, and I know they have fulfilled their mission. If they say, well, I've been in for a year or two, and my dog got sick and something happened, then that's a different story. But how do we translate that to people that aren't as initiated as we are? It's a challenge.
Any thoughts?
Well, I think, again, it's about the information flow. And back to Susan's question, there's too much ad hocery out there and not enough science and programmery in there. And so I do think that much more vibrant interchanges between the civil society and the military, and like I said earlier, offering portals to come into an active duty environment and serve and then depart. And then also offering portals going the other direction. So if you have a career officer who's 20 to 27 years, you know, my little brother, he is a 2-star Air Force officer. He just got his 2nd star and has rubbed that in my face for the last month and a half. But he, and I sent him my tax return. But he's the contracting officer of the Air Force. Now, he would love the chance to step aside for just a year or two and be under the tutelage of a CFO in one of our great companies. And what an incredible thing for our military to get him back with that perspective, to have that rounding and to come back and attack things like procurement reform and acquisition reform. And then if you think about that, when he does hang up his spurs, wow, he'll be very valuable to that. They'll probably want him back. And I just think that those are the types of things that if we're going to make a science of this, that's the direction we should go.
I think fellowships are huge. Fellowships, internships are wonderful, and I think we should do more and more of those. Kind of where Blaine's going a little bit, I think, but more fellowships with organizations would be tremendous. And I think it's not just with the officer corps, it's with the enlisted corps. Get our enlisted service members to do a fellowship. Can you imagine going up to some young sergeant who's done real well and say, hey, how would you like to do a fellowship with this company? I mean, I think they would be excited to get to do that and show their skills to some company and then come back and continue on in the military. So I think that's something that we could do, which would help spread the word so that others understand the military much better.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah. And I mean, there are already programs where the military encourages people to go to various colleges and universities for certain levels of training. Why couldn't that be also done for the private sector as well?
Exactly.
And
Now, I would say that on a positive side, the military probably does more of that than the civilian side does. The civilian side doesn't send someone off on a fellowship for a year. to another company to work. They don't do that.
No.
They don't send people to a war college for a year to get a professional experience. They just don't do that. The challenge is there's only so many dollars. There's only so much effort that can be done. I don't think we'll see an explosion of fellowships, an explosion of train with industry anytime soon.
Possibly not, but it's one of those things that if the industry could be viewed to potentially subsidize that,
Oh, now you're talking.
then there's something else entirely. You know, have the military. You know, a number of companies have foundations that they particularly are engaged in something like that, and that's a possibility certainly for some of the larger ones. I will say this: is that there's also the flip side. Is that in the one occasion, particularly after 9/11, when a number of reservists were called up and were essentially getting enforced reversed internships, shall we say, is that they were getting the military experience. Admittedly, they were already in the reserve. There wasn't but in some cases they were in the, I believe even a few cases where they were in readiness reserve. They weren't even in full reserve, and the companies didn't know what to do with them. They didn't know how to handle having these reliable individuals suddenly gone for months or even a couple of cases years. And that is a particularly significant issue.
Yeah, one of the frustrations for me is you know, focusing on the fact that, you know, this isn't really done in an aggressive way by somebody. And who is that somebody? I'm sitting here thinking to myself. And then I thought of an individual who's now deceased, but Jim Kimsey, who was a West Point graduate and was one of the founders of AOL and served as its chairman and everything else. I mean, the first thing I'd do if I were in charge of this exercise would be to try and identify what corporate leaders actually went through one of these military academies and spent time in the military and get them to take a leadership position on this. And they network like mad around the country and at Davos and all the rest of it, and to be able to take that opportunity, because it really is way too important to hope that the federal government's going to get its act together to start programs or to even, you know, reform the ones that already exist. Just a thought.
One thing I do want to touch on is, I know we're running towards the close of the panel, is that I do think it was touched on in the beginning, and I do think it needs to be brought up again, is that the issue of the draft and compulsory service. It's something that has been brought up a number of different times. Some people have actively suggested bringing the draft back. Some people have suggested maybe a compromise kind of program, like where you don't necessarily do military service, but you do some sort of compulsory national service. And there are certainly countries that we know of which do service programs, Israel being in many ways the most comprehensive, but you have ones in South Korea and Singapore and a number of others. Is that, what are the upsides and downsides to that? I'm not even talking about political feasibility, but I mean, if we're just going to talk about is that if we were going to do something, what are the upsides and downsides, and what could we get out of it?
I feel very, very passionate about this issue. I think, and it's nothing to do with military service, I think, as Americans, we have become so divided over the last 30, 40 years. It's so many things. It's pop culture, it's the news cycle, it's so many different things in this kind of toxic ooze that gets these divisions going. And what I would say more than anything is we need to do things in the country that unites us and brings us together. And we need to do more that shared experiences, that we have a stake in one another. And so I absolutely support a mandatory national service when you're a young person coming out of high school, or at some time if you want to have it over a 10-year window that you have to do this service. But what a great thing if we had this experience in our generations, and then long after they've served in these places, hey, where'd you do your service? Oh, I was at forestry. Oh, well, I was in the Peace Corps. Oh, well, I was a Marine. And it gives us a chance to invest in our nation, and we take a stake in the game. We got skin in the game. Right. And right now, I don't think we have enough skin in the game in terms of our investments in one another as Americans, not Republicans.
Yeah.
I've always been a proponent of some kind of national service of some kind, and as Blaine said, we can figure out when that is. I think it's important for young people to see that there's something bigger than themselves for the rest of their life. And I think it'll also shape, as you mentioned, don't think you're going to go in the same direction. You know, no telling where you're going to go. And I was saying recently, I've never met someone wherever I've been that when I've spoken or I've been in an event where people that have served have always found me, and the first thing they want to tell me, from whether they're a CEO or whatever they've done in their life, but they want to make sure I know they served. Yep. They served and their nation, and they would say, well, I only served this many years, and I would say, what do you mean not this many? You served. So it gives them a different perspective. So I think if we had that and of course it doesn't have to be the military, I agree, but to serve something bigger than yourself is key, because I think it'll really bring our nation closer together.
Well, those are two excellent points. I would simply add to this is that one of the great tragedies is Americans don't know how other Americans live. And to be able to bridge the socioeconomic divisions in this country would be enormous. It was one of the great benefits of the draft, and I can understand why the military doesn't want to reinstitute it, but certainly I would be an enthusiastic supporter of military service.
Well, since I came in during the draft, I said it would be, if I'm going to be drafted, I'd just soon be an officer and serve longer, and I did. I think it's going to take a lot of conversation, and particularly with the military, because my bet would be right now that the leadership of the military does not want to draft. There's some complicators with that are, including that it takes more than 2 years to make someone a capable mariner or a soldier or a Marine. So it would take a lot of conversation. And then where's the conversation going to come from? Is it going to, if it doesn't come from the military, is it going to come from other people that maybe haven't been in the military? And how's that going to go? So I don't know how you do the conversation. But I do agree that national service would be a wonderful thing. I just don't know how you get there.
But we're at the point right now where, in addition to just even military, civilian, different kinds of service, however it is, we've had dialogues in other parts of the conference talking about the need for job training, for vocational training, for skills, for connections. And ultimately, that's part of that larger conversation, is that not only do we need to bond, but we need to get people ready for the next phase. And not only as society changes, as the economy changes. And it's worth remembering, it's just as we talked about on this panel, is that ultimately we're talking about holistic aspects of American society. And this is, and this is American society as a whole. And we're talking about individuals who have chosen to serve, who have actively, who serve our country in different ways and have that mentality. And in some ways, it's one of the most valuable things is how do you share that mentality and get other people to buy into something larger and to contribute? Because that's ultimately what we need, is that we need that ability to contribute to society as a whole and not just spend our time looking in the mirror or at the TV set. So, or smartphone. So I'd like to thank everyone for a great panel, for very informative, and thank our audience, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference.
Thank you.